Good afternoon. My name is James Deitch, and I'm here to do a presentation for you today on public history. About 25 years ago, I had moved to Leesburg, Florida, and I worked for a family by the name of Pringle. Family had been there for, at the time, over 90 years. Originally from Scotland, they had immigrated to Illinois and eventually had moved to Lake County, Florida, where they were very influential. The family had bought and developed land on a small scale until George Pringle, a World War II veteran, returning from service in France, Germany, and Austria, started the company in its more modern form. They had a lot of land holdings throughout Lake County, and it was a great honor to work for the family. One evening at dinner, inquiring about George's service, he had won the Silver Star in Austria. He mentioned offhandedly that during World War II, Leesburg, Florida, like many small towns across the United States, hosted German prisoners of war that had been captured during the war and transported to the United States for keeping until the war was over. It was just a very brief comment. I really didn't think much of it until years later, this year, as a matter of fact, remembering back as to how I could best approach a project like public history. And I thought, what a great way to do that, to tie war and society. So, thinking back to that, I did a little bit of research, and the land that was in question is currently Lake Sumter State College. Across the road, Highway 27, is the regional airport. All of that land had been owned by the Pringle family at one point. And early in the war, the family decided that they would donate the land to the Army Air Corps, what is predecessor to our current Air Force. They set up an airfield there, and as part of that airfield, they also housed prisoners of war. And how they came to be there is a rather long story that we'll get into today. But when I approached the college and also the Historical Society in Lake County to talk about it, they were very excited. They had some knowledge of the fact that the German prisoners were there. They even had some artifacts and some other information that they could share with me. Dr. Heather Begard was very enthusiastic, lending resources. Kevin Arms, the Dean of Library Services and Archives, quickly got on board. A retired professor by the name of Peter Keedy got involved, as well as a couple gentlemen that volunteer at the Lake County Historical Society Museum, all of which had bits and pieces of the story and artifacts. And so this culminated in what is a very exciting public history project that will not end with this classroom assignment, but rather will catalog and inventory the various artifacts and information that both of the entities, the college and the Historical Society, have in their possession. They have talked about doing a documentary film on this, and certainly having more of an exhibition than they currently have in the museum. And I look forward to being part of that process as we move forward through this. The other exciting part of the project was to focus in on American exceptionalism, our Judeo-Christian values, our American ideals, democracy in general. And I think back to Winthrop's A Shining City on the Hill. Of course, that goes back to the classics where it originated, and then originally in the Bible. And America has always valued itself as that city on the hill. We remember that Ronald Reagan even incorporated that into one of his famous speeches. So the idea was to tie war and society together. And this is kind of interesting because on a separate subject with respect to military history, some of you may have heard the term total war. I've written extensively on it myself, and there's a lot of different ideas as to what constitutes total war. Without getting too far into that subject, I'll simply define it as that which entails involving not only the entirety of a country's military, but also its industrial output, its citizens, et cetera, et cetera. It's total war. It's complete war for a country. In the strictest sense of it, it's total war on behalf of both of the belligerents to a war, all of the belligerents to a war. World War II wasn't really total war for the United States. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor, certainly, and we expended a great deal of our uh, wealth of young people in the war, and certainly engaged a lot of our industrial production. So the society at large was engaged in the war effort, but we didn't really feel it at home. And the government did a good job of trying to keep the public distanced from the horrors of what was an exceptionally harsh war. Um, but this will attempt to go ahead and make again that connection to war and society, and see how this tiny community of Leesburg, Florida, was able to have direct connection, not only with the belligerents that we fought against in the war, but actual interaction with the German prisoners themselves. All told, there were 378,000 German prisoners, also Italian prisoners, but mostly German prisoners, that were detained, interned, and brought to the United States for imprisonment for the duration of the war, actually going into 1946 after the war had ended, before they repatriated them. There were 550 camps around the country, 45 of the 48 states. Remember, Hawaii and Alaska were not yet states, they were territories at the time. So almost every state in the country somehow was touched by the prisoners that were brought here. Western civilization, of course, has always had a commitment to human dignity and values, and this was in great contrast to Nazi ideology. For all of the horrors that we become accustomed to in our learning about the war and how it occurred, the United States was determined that their servicemen and their people would demonstrate the ideals and values that Americans hold to be so important for a lot of different reasons. The other thing is that we will refer several times in this presentation to the Geneva Convention. Just as a important footnote, there's two Geneva Conventions, uh, the original one from 1929, the updated one from 1949. All of those were based on two separate Hague Conventions that appeared in the 1870s and 1890s. So there's a long history of addressing how war should be conducted, but more importantly for this conversation, how prisoners and detained individuals should be handled during times of war. But one thing was clear, that the United States intended to lead by example in how we treated our prisoners. And this was an experiment that served a couple different purposes. First of all, um, with the exception of the Civil War, we really had not seen prisoners held at the level that we were seeing during World War II. Keep in mind that the numbers that I quoted there, 378,000, that exceeded the entire amount of those serving in the military prior to the war. So think about that. We had as much prisoners of war from the enemy here in the United States as we had actually in service at the time. That should cause some concern right off the bat. They, of course, would address that later on, but that was one of the impacts that having so many American prisoners in custody would have on us. Somebody would have to guard those prisoners. Presumably, they would come from the military, and that was less military that could be deployed overseas. So a lot of ideas that had to be sorted through there. Now, I had mentioned that this was an experiment. The other component of that, the second part of the experiment, was to follow the idea that if we treated the German prisoners of war properly, with dignity, with respect, with all of the things that are consistent with our ideals and values, that we would have a certain level of expectation that American prisoners would be treated the same way. So, because the Swiss delegates and the International Red Cross would be monitoring the treatment of prisoners both on their side and our side, it was bound to happen that word would get back. We understood that. And so we wanted to control the messaging, right? Not from propaganda, from genuine, unique adherence to our core values and our ideals and our Judeo Christian ethics. So the idea is that we would follow through on what we should be doing anyway, and that word would then filter back, and potentially that the Germans would treat American prisoners of war um, at least with some consideration with respect to how we treated theirs. Now, how did they wind up coming to this country so early? We were engaged in the war only from the standpoint that we were attacked by Japan in December of 1941. Of course, Germany declared war in a gesture of alliance with Japan immediately following. But at that time, we had been exercising a isolationist attitude, much like we had done during World War I. We were reluctant to directly get involved in a war in Europe. Uh, Kind of makes us recall back to George Washington warning early on when he was president, the first president of the United States, saying avoid being involved in the issues that concern Europe, that we should not have an interest there. And so we followed those guidelines in World War I. We were late to the dance when it came to World War I. Wilson was very reluctant to get involved in that. Roosevelt, too, while he may have felt some kind of need to go ahead and cooperate with the British, he showed restraint, and that's where the Lend-Lease program came into play. By April of 1942, or let me digress for a moment. At the time, there were only 431 APWs that were even held in the United States. So it was a big jump to go ahead and start taking on massive amounts of prisoners of war. But the British had a problem. They were under attack themselves. They were very, very heavily engaged in the war at this point. And they had 50,000 surplus prisoners that they needed to deal with. They needed to hand off. And so we, through an agreement with the first Earl of Halifax, Edward Lindley, negotiated for the receipt of those prisoners. And by April of 1942, the United States, particularly the military and their JAG Corps, had put together regulations concerning the handling of prisoners, trying to preempt how we were going to deal with all of this. It was very important that we organize and understand uniformly how we were going to deal with the problem of accepting that many prisoners into the United States and keep it quiet, too. Most of the troops were coming from Rommel, Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps, the famous field marshal that fought valiantly through northern Africa. His troops were very fierce. They were not conscripts. They were gentlemen, professional soldiers that believed in the ideology. They were primarily Nazis. They bought into the whole Hitler aura, and they were hardcore, and they were very disciplined, highly trained soldiers. The balance of the prisoners that we saw early on were captured U-boat crews that were captured in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea. So these were not exactly zealots, but there were certainly zealots amongst them, and they were all hardcore. They were going to treat their imprisonment with honor and dignity according to how they understood it and what their values were at the time. So we needed to understand how we were going to deal with them, and the regulations that were employed in 1942 would address that. They didn't quite know what they were getting into at this time. The other thing that we needed to understand is how could we employ them for the war effort, and in that there was a couple problems. There was a problem with the Geneva Convention. There was also a problem with civilian sensibilities, if you will. We had massive American labor shortages as we increased those that were deploying overseas to fight the war on two fronts. Eventually, the men were leaving. They were not tending the farms. They were not doing the jobs in the urban areas. They were not working in the factories. They weren't conducting the basic services that were needed. So the prisoners of war brought a solution to that, but they also had conflicts with the Geneva Convention on what we could do and what we couldn't do. We classified the prisoners into three different categories. Some were payable categories, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some were not, and it also depended on whether they were officers and non-commissioned officers. But we had vacancies in textiles, agricultural, canneries, mills, construction, and in the maintaining of the camps themselves. Some personnel were going to be needed for that. So with 500 POW camps across the country, most of them were concentrated in the South, the Southwest, where the climates were more moderate and warm, and agriculture was able to be produced year-round, which was important for the war effort, but also for maintaining the civilian population. So that was one consideration as to how they would be treated. Leesburg really lent itself to that because it is a agricultural area historically that is less today than it used to be. But at the time, the vast majority of grapefruits and tangerines and oranges and other produce came out of that region just north of Orlando, Florida. The other thing they were dealing with at the time, of course, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not the focus of the subject, but we do need to acknowledge that civil rights had not been completed. Blacks were not treated the same in this country, particularly in the South. And so, there was a lot of problems that occurred because of the German prisoners being here and whether they wanted to pay people to do the work. But still, they would arrest the blacks and push them into service as well through vagrancy laws and other laws that sometimes are referred to as Jim Crow laws. It was a no work, no eat policy that applied to blacks just like it did to German prisoners of war. And there's been enough written about that almost becomes a separate subject in itself. Returning to the idea of compensation, officers needed to be compensated equal to the same rate as they would have been if they were in their home country. So, with the Americans being paid much higher than the Axis powers, they simply need to be paid their same compensation they would have been paid by the Wehrmacht in Germany. There was no work requirement on officers. They could do so voluntarily, but they had to be paid. The NCOs, on the other hand, non-commissioned officers, could only be employed in supervisory roles. They would get paid at the rate of 80 cents a day for working, and there was no requirement in the Geneva Conventions that they be compensated at the salary rates that they were compensated for by the Wehrmacht. The same applied to non-rates, PFCs, privates, low-ranking individuals. However, the United States, in a unique turn, gave them a gratuity of $3 as well as 80 cents a day, $3 a month, and then 80 cents a day for any work performed. Eventually, that would become a no work, no eat policy as well, but that would come later in the war and primarily after the concentration camps and prisoner of war camps were discovered in Germany and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. Nazi ideology was a big problem in the camps, though, and discipline was something that the guards had not thought that they were going to have to deal with. When I say discipline, it wasn't discipline against the American guards. It was discipline by the Nazis within the camps against those that they considered to be traitors or those that were cooperating with the enemy in their eyes. Dorothy Thompson, who was a very well-known columnist at the time, was the first journalist to be expelled from Nazi Germany in 1933. She learned of this, and she appealed to Eleanor Roosevelt in the White House directly, who, of course, appealed to her husband. President Roosevelt quickly gathered the secretaries of state and secretaries of war and came up with a way to go ahead and gain compliance and create some diversity that was of a positive nature. And so they looked at Article 17 of the Geneva Convention as a way around the exclusion of indoctrination as a way of controlling them. The Geneva Convention did not allow for any propaganda, any indoctrination, any re-education. But Article 17 of the Geneva Convention from 1929 basically allowed intellectual and sporting pursuits to be used. Mediums would be presented in the way of newspapers, magazines, music, movies, things of that nature that could expose the Germans to Western civilization as we know it. Education, culture, and introduction to democracy, civics, history, American history. All of this was taught in English, which also contributed to their English skills, making them better suited for what the American military intended for them to do down the road. There was also a German language newspaper, Das Ruf, The Call in English, that was published twice a month at a cost of 5 cents to the prisoners. Originally, with the first runs, there was 11,000 that were distributed. Ultimately, it would be 73,000. And a couple of those individuals that produced the newspaper would actually begin to produce it a year later in Germany for those prisoners who had been repatriated at that time. Henry Stinson, the Secretary of War, said that it was very improbable that we could Americanize these Germans, but we could certainly get them to respect our institutions. And this would become important when the Germans would return back to Europe. Some of them would have to be imprisoned again to serve out additional sentences. Others would return right back into Germany, but they wanted them to return with these values and ideals that they had learned here in the United States. Three very interesting characters that I came across in this. I have letters from them and documents that they actually provided were three former German prisoners of war, Fritz Fitting, Hausbruns, and Hermann Bettig. All three of those wrote accounts of their stay for the purpose of a capstone paper that was written by Robin C. Tinsley about Leesburg during World War II. I was able to get a copy of that, and in turn was able to gain access to original documents and artifacts from those. So again, it's a great way to tie war and society in, talk about the Geneva Convention, and address how they were going to interact. Quite a few people in Leesburg actually interacted and have memories and would recount those memories later on, and a lot of that is access. While they were here as recreation on Sundays, the German prisoners would often swim in the lakes. They kept pets. They worked out in the citrus groves, on the farms. They built houses. They actually participated in building the Minute Maid orange plant in downtown Leesburg, and worked in the packing plant, the citrus packing plant in Tavares, which stood only until a few years ago when it was torn down. Having lived in Leesburg for quite a few years myself, I'm very familiar with these sites and was not aware of the connection. They also built a number of homes in downtown Leesburg during that time when there was a building boom. So just an amazing deep knowledge that's been found, and an excitement to broaden this and build on this and create it into an exhibition that will appeal to the residents there that have memories of them, but also more importantly to the people that have shown up in Leesburg and Lake County after the citrus groves have gone and the packing plant's been closed down and the German prisoners have long been gone. It's a way to bring that history to life and preserve it. Those open fields now have a college and an airport, many buildings, developments, retail, and all of that in an area that had none of that at the time. It was interesting at the end of the prisoner experience here in the United States, they surveyed 27,147 of them, giving them a survey of basically what their experience was like and what they took away. And it was interesting that 74% of the German prisoners of war, 74% of the 23,000 plus anyway, took a lot of the values and ideals back with them. They had an appreciation for the training. They had an appreciation for democracy. And the idea at the end is that these individuals would go back and become the police officers and the administrators and the government officials that would rebuild Germany and turn it into what it would become ultimately. Western Germany became the model where the French and the British and Americans held onto the land. It was a long time coming for Eastern Germany, but post-Cold War, they have become one of our greatest allies, certainly a great democracy in themselves. And this has just been an absolutely exciting project. We're not done with the project. There's still a lot of work to do to get the exhibition done in the documentary film, which I will be working on long after this class. And I really appreciate the contacts that I've made to the community. And so this becomes a very different type of doing history than the academic history that we're all accustomed to. Public history becomes more personal, makes a connection to the community, and it gets people excited about it. I wouldn't say that you have to dumb it down, but you have to definitely find a way that gives it bite-sized pieces to deliver to the people so that they can absorb it and understand, how it impacts them and what it means for the community. So I hope you all shared the same experience in your own pursuits with public history. It has certainly been a pleasure to do this one, and I look forward to the feedback and comments that you might have regarding this. Thank you.